So hello and welcome to Project Oneness World. Today we are in conversation with Marjorie Hlava. Marjorie is the president, chairman, and founder of Access Innovations, Inc. She has been actively involved in a number of important associations. She is a past president of the National Federation of Advanced Information Services, called NFAIS, and a past president of the Association for Information Science and Technology, ASIST. And ASIST recognized her with its highest award, the Award of Merit in 2014, as well as the Watson Davis Award in 1996. Among her numerous awards and recognitions, which also includes 2 patents, she is the recipient of the Special Libraries Association SLA Joint Cotton Dana Award, as well as the President's Award. She is recognized as an SLA Fellow and an Albuquerque Business First Woman of Influence for Technology. And in 2014, she received the Miles Conrad Lectureship for NFAIS, and she was elected to the Hubble Hall of Fame in 2019. And Marjorie has published over 200 articles and 4 books on information science topics, and with a 5th one on the way now. And she is an expert in taxonomies, metadata, and data science, and a pioneer in databases and search. And active in standards development, Marjorie has worked particularly on various standards which you may or may not have heard of, but are extremely important. And these include Dublin Core Z3984 and Credit Z39.104, Thesaurus Z39.19, and ISO 25964 SSOS, Abstracts Z39.14, and she has contributed metadata set for the DOI syntax. And still very active, Marjorie has recently agreed to chair the ISO 25964 Committee for the Standard on Structured Vocabularies. And I've greatly enjoyed my conversations with Marjorie during our ASIST annual meetings. And last November at Pittsburgh, we were together during the Standards Committee meeting and the past president's reception at ASIST. And I'm so glad to speak with you today, Marjorie, and thank you for making the time. I know that you've had a late flight, and despite that, you made the time today. So thank you.
Yeah, well, it's life in the fast lane. What can I say?
So Marjorie, so we'll start with a bigger question, I think, so that you can tell your story in your own words, and you can make it as short or as long as you want to.
Well, since a lot of your subsequent questions cover things in more detail, I think I'll just say I was born in Michigan. The lake behind me is a lake in Upper Michigan, but I was born in Manistee, and when I was 6 weeks old, we moved to California. And notable things along that road, in a rusty old pickup and a travel trailer behind it, was that in the Dakotas, the car broke down, and my dad used a safety pin from my diapers to fix the car. And when he sold it some years later, that diaper pin was still there holding things together. So I come from kind of a can-do family. No sense bemoaning things when you can do something about it. And I think probably more than anything that has really impacted where I've gone. We were never rich, although we were always very well educated. But then a lot of really famous people died impoverished. So it's the way it is. But we lived in California for quite a few years. My dad was in the lumber business, so he wanted to experience all the aspects of it firsthand. Until a good friend of his died in his arms with a crushed skull from a fallen limb, that he decided it was time to go back to school at the University of Michigan and finish up. So when I was 6, we moved back to Michigan and eventually found our way to Wisconsin, which is where I did my schooling. But my mom was quite intent on having, she worked on her nursing degrees, having 10 acres and a stream as a place to have us grow up. So instead of buying a nice house, we bought a not so nice house, but it was on 10 acres, and it eventually became 55 acres, and there was a wonderful pair of streams running through it. Wow. We went to a 1-room grade school. My brother and I was there the whole time in 1 room, same room, for 7 years. and then took a 22-mile bus ride to my high school each way, each morning and evening. And one of the big annoyances of my youth was that since I finished all my homework on the bus, I couldn't leave my books on the bus instead of having them trudge up into the house and dump them and then take them out again in the morning. So went to the University of Wisconsin, that's where I met my husband. In high school, I had worked at the library, and I learned a lot about library science from the librarian, whose name was Miss Ducky. And she was just a charming, charming lady and totally immersed in what she did. Then when I went to college, I got a job at the biology library and also in the biology building in the botanical herbarium. So I worked for a man named Gordon Luce in the library and for Hugh Iltus in the herbarium, and majored in botany. In the biology library, after a bit of time, Mr. Luce decided that I could reclassify the German collection, and there was a tremendous amount of science done in German, particularly in botanical information. I would reclassify all of those books into Library Congress from Cutter. And so I needed to learn a lot about how those systems work. And I fell in love with Cutter. I loved his writings. I liked the way he thought. I still do. I think that he understood what retrieval needed to be like. And so although I had to reclassify to Jefferson's LC system, I did find that Cutter had the better way of it, I thought, in understanding how things put together and how we should organize information in the long run. And cataloging to the most specific level, taking the terms as they occur. Now we call that natural language instead of inverting them, and all those kinds of things. He said that a well-organized collection becomes an army. And he wrote with flowing prose, loved it. Anyway, came out to New Mexico with my husband, who's a geologist. I met him at the University of Wisconsin, both of us to pursue advanced degrees out here, and got stuck. So I got a graduate student job working for NASA at the University of New Mexico. There was an installation called the Technology Application Center, which was part of the NASA Scientific and Technical Information Facility. And I joined that, first doing research of chemical abstracts and biological abstracts. Both of those had about 18 volumes, and they were thick volumes every 6 months. And they had what's called a permuted index, and then they had abstracts. And so you would look through those permuted indexes for the keywords that you were most interested in, and then flip to the abstract to see if that was an article worth retrieving, usually through interlibrary loan. The first remarkable search I remember was one on the photoreceptors, the eye photoreceptors in golden mantled ground squirrels. And it was fascinating. I found 2 articles. Two. I was so frustrated. The man that I did the search for was thrilled. He was over the moon. And I learned a lot about what the researcher goes through to try to find information and get it organized. And the reason he'd hired me is because he didn't want to do all that stuff himself. And so then when those systems started going online, NASA Recon being one of the first ones, Dialogue coming shortly thereafter, the Dialogue Information Systems from Lockheed Missiles and Space, my boss then, Mr. Birch, decided that I should learn how to do those things. So I did. About that time, I was thinking, this graduate school stuff is exhausting. This is much more interesting work that I'm doing in my job. And eventually, over the 5 years that I was there, I became head of the information department. I did training nationwide for NASA with the NASA Recon system. I carried at first a 45-pound remote terminal plus another modem, which weighed 10 pounds, which was an acoustic coupler. But it allowed me to get in on the ground floor of all that kind of stuff. My first searching was done using a teletype, which was 150 CPS, 15 characters per second. It had the double helix keys. So you'd push your finger down, and I actually have short fingers. So you push the key down, and two sets of scissor gears would pop up. Most people used a case on their, or the later ones had cases on top of them. So you typed them like a typewriter, but not the early ones. And my fingers are constantly getting tangled up. And at 15 characters per second, that was a big deal because I typed faster than that. It's frustrating. But the information that came across and was printed first on ticker tapes and then on the thermal paper, which disappeared when you put it in the sunlight. In New Mexico, there's a lot of sun. Was full of interesting tidbits and certainly a lot faster than going through those 18 volumes every 6 months and doing a 10-year or more retrospective search of the literature. So I learned a lot about that, and it was a fabulous opportunity. I discovered the writings of a group called the CASATI, the Council on Scientific and Technical Information, which was convened in Oak Ridge by a fellow named Alan Weinberg, whom I met actually. And I was astounded. It was like science fiction, all the things that they thought we could do. And that CASATI report and the resulting test thesaurus was incredibly insightful work. In fact, not everything that those guys discussed and envisioned has yet come to happen, but it's certainly a landmark set of papers for the information industry. I joined a local chapter of SLA. There was a fellow named Craig Lickness, who was a librarian. I wasn't, as a botanist. And he encouraged me to join the chapter. He said, I know that, Margie, but what you do is really library science and documentation, and you're a documentalist. And I thought, I'm a botanist. But I joined the chapter, found some fascinating people in the SLA chapter, because Los Alamos National Labs and Sandia National Labs are both here in New Mexico. We have 2 of the 9 national laboratories, as well as people from other remarkable research institutions, including the university. And so I could continue learning a lot. And I became active in that society, broadening my network. And that same year, I joined ACES. I joined it because I was invited to give a paper at the ACES meeting. Really? Me? So I went and I did, but there I met the people at that time. ACES was where the heavy integration, the partnership between industry, research, and academia was very, very, very active. It had a huge exhibit hall of people who were willing to be entrepreneurs at the time, and it was a fascinating experience to see all these people talking to each other, sometimes shouting at each other, about the things that we have come to know now as information science.
And which year was this when you joined?
1976.
76, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I joined SLA, I think, in 74, or somewhere in there, but I was active in the local chapters first, and then but ACES has never had really a local chapter that covered New Mexico. They had one that covered the West, which, if you live in the West, is a bigger space than people tend to realize. So just because they're having a meeting in Denver 9 hours away does not mean that I can pop up there and join in. So anyway, that's kind of a thumbnail of what happened in my bringing me to where I am today. In 1978, I thought, I am so tired of this bureaucracy. There was the university bureaucracy as well as the government bureaucracy. And by that time I was information director for the National Energy Information Center, which was in Washington, D.C. in the Forrestal building, and its affiliate, which was in Albuquerque. And so I had 37 people working for me in Albuquerque. I had 7 people that either worked for me or with me. I was not the director, I was the information director in DC. So once a month, I would catch the 4:30 a.m. flight out of Albuquerque, go to my meetings in Washington, and catch the 7 o'clock flight back so I could be home with my husband and my 2 little kids. I was also running a project for the Bureau of Business and Economic Research here in New Mexico. And I had become information director at TAC, at the Technology Application Center, and I was doing nationwide training. And I thought, I'd like to build these databases. And I learned how to do private file development from Betty Unruh at Dialogue. And when CDC, Controlled Data Corporation, came in and asked if we would do some databases for them, I said, yeah. And I was, by that time, feeling my oats and a bit annoyed. And the day we signed the contract, and a couple of other things happened too, I resigned. And I started my own business. I took 6 other staff members with me. Jay Van Nieman, who was there measuring the technology as it was applied, was not part of that original, the original cohort, but he joined us later in December of 78.
That's 45 years ago.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And it's been quite a ride. So I guess that's the thumbnail, and the business has grown, and my kids are very capable, and my husband and I are still happy.
Thank you, Margie. I know it's a lot, and you have been a pioneer and a stalwart of the field and the industry for so long, and trying to sum up the various things that you have done in your lifetime, and until now, and you're still active. In a short few minutes is like, I know it's like, okay, trying to just touch the surface. So maybe I'll take you back to your childhood, and you said you're from a can-do family. So I like that, because I think when I think of you and of all my interactions with you, I see you as a can-do person, right? I think that's pretty much who you are. I think if you take away your CV and if you take away everything, and if you say that who is Margie, I think Margie is a can-do person.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you think, I think I'll go with that part first. So how do you think that can-do spirit has shaped your thinking and your leadership and your mentoring and everything else that you've done, and that line of thought?
Well, before I answer that, another thought occurred to me, which is that it's hard for me to think of myself as a pioneer, although I know that my CV is long and I've done a lot of things. Because when you're doing it, you're not doing it because you want to be a pioneer. You're doing it because it needs doing.
Right.
And you can bring together a group of people to make it happen. And I think that's probably what has shaped me. My family, I told you we were always well educated. My grandfather got his civil engineering degree from the University of Michigan in 1918. My great-grandfather helped found that school. And so they were educators, or they were educated, and they knew the value of reading. My great-grandfather had a number of patents himself. He patented the swivel bridge that you might see sometimes in the middle of a railroad bridge that you might see in the middle of a river that pivots to the direction of the flow and then goes out again for the train to go across. That's a J.J. Hubble invention. He also invented a machine to remove the chaff from the wheat kernels.
Okay.
So that after you've thrashed the wheat, you have it harvested, you have all this stuff and it's got that nasty cover on it, and what you want is the grain. So
that's a very important machine. I wish we could do that with misinformation.
It would be handy.
Yeah.
Anyway, it wasn't because he wanted to get a patent. It was because he thought it important to find a way to do those things. So my grandfather died, my mother's dad, when she was 10. And it had been right after the crash. So during the Great Depression, they had lost not only all their money in the crash, but also my grandfather, the main breadwinner. There were 4 children in that family, and because my grandmother had been a teacher, and she got a teaching degree from the University from Ypsilanti in Michigan, and then she got married after she paid off her debts. She wasn't getting married till she paid off her debts.
Yeah.
And I lived with her off and on for several years. And so a lot of what I learned came also from her. She's very influential in my life. She wouldn't let us swear, for example. You may not use those words. That is really low class. You can't do that. So don't use any of those words. And today, even still, people use this F word, and every time they say it, it's like somebody slapped me in the face. It just, it's jarring. But what we could do was quote Shakespeare. Now, if you've ever read very much Shakespeare, he has some really nasty phrases in there. The devil, black thou cow-faced loon. But we couldn't just quote Shakespeare. We needed to say scene, act, and scene of where the term came from. So we would plow through books learning those nasty phrases to yell at people. And I remember once in grade school, I got into terrible trouble because my I called one of the people who was teasing me a psychobiological organism.
Yeah.
And he said to Mrs. Steinke, our teacher, who taught all at that time 9 grades in the grade school, Margie's swearing at me again. And she said, what did you call him, Margie? And I said, I called him a psychobiological organism, but I have some doubts about whether he's capable of anything with the psycho part, meaning that no, stupid, no brain. Yeah. Anyway, a lot of those things shaped me early. We didn't have much money. My dad went to work for a company called That and Russell and made a good salary, but then he quit and founded his own business, and he had a series of businesses over the years. But it always meant that the money was going to the company and not to us. Yeah. So my mom worked as a nurse, first a charge nurse at miscellaneous hospitals in the neighborhood. That's where she met those Agarwals, among other people. But she also then was fascinated by the human brain. She just loved every weird thing that our brains can do. So she went to work at a place called North Division, which was a mental hospital at that time, and then the Racine County Mental Health Clinics, and then got a job for the last 18 years that she worked at the Milwaukee County House of Correction, which was a short-term facility. So that's where the people who were going to be held for 30 days to 2 years, and often those awaiting trial would be there. So Ed Gein and Jeffrey Dahmer were both people that she met. She was the only woman in the facility. And every now and then there'd be a riot and a lockdown. And the interesting thing was that the prisoners would form a cordon around her and protect Mrs. Kimmel because she took care of them. So, you know, just other pieces from my youth. In the meantime, I was home taking care of the kids because Dad was working late and Mom was working. So I came home from school, didn't get to leave my books on the bus, and took care of the kids.
Yeah.
I learned to drive when I was 12, but I didn't get my license till I was 18 because Dad had started a company out in Idaho, and so he wasn't there, so I couldn't get my driver's license, and they wouldn't let my mother sign because she was married.
Oh, so she had to have her husband's
So you had to have
signatures.
a husband's signature. So Mr. Betcher, who was my friend's father and also the town constable, would come up to me at meetings and say, "Got your license, Margie?" "Not yet." "Not yet, Mr. Betcher. Sorry." He'd say, "Well, then you be careful then." He knew I didn't have my license. He also knew I needed to drive so I could take the kids places.
Right.
So a lot of those kinds of things just shaped what we did. You know, we had a 2-acre garden to feed the family. I canned 100 quarts of beans one year, green beans.
Wow.
And Mom decided we'd go into the chicken business in a dairy farming countryside. So we had 2,000 chickens. And then when she decided to go to work full time, we slaughtered them all in a 2-week time period. And I could gut and dress a chicken in my sleep. It was awful. So those just give you some vignettes of the kinds of things that we just had to do. It was a farming country mystique. My dad had grown up in an orphanage in Pennsylvania, the Hershey Boys School, Milton Hershey School for orphan and half orphan boys. I did notice, though, that sometimes men seem to have the upper hand, which always, why is this? And for example, my driver's license, which I couldn't get, but worked around that. When my grandfather died and my grandmother was there with 4 children, she was a teacher. But back then, women with carnal knowledge could not teach. And obviously, if she had 4 children, she had carnal knowledge. Now, if she'd been married, she could have taught. But because she was a widow, she couldn't. It was very odd rules at the time. When I went to work at TAC, I was, after a bit in the management roles, I was the only woman in management. And actually, I had an all-male staff. So I went to coffee twice a day with the guys, and I learned to girl watch with the rest of them. So I could say, "Look at that one."
Okay.
If you can't beat them, join them. So, and they accepted me just as I am. It doesn't mean that because you're a girl, you're any lesser. It just means you have a different tool set. So use the tool set you got. Okay, so that gives you a can-do kind of background.
Yes, I think it's it gives them quite a bit, and it's fascinating. I think your varied experiences since childhood and the different influences that you've had also sort of shaped into a lot of the different things that you did, I think. And I see it all coming together, for instance. I don't know a lot about you, like, but whatever I know, right, I see it fitting in into the person that you are. So you told me about how did you get into the field and what led you to start the company. So I think we'll skip that part. But what do you think have been some of the most significant steps and turning points in your career so far?
Well, I think that there are a number of them, of course. So getting, as I outlined earlier, getting to actually work in the nitty-gritty level. I mean, I was a student working in a university library. So to be able to reclassify a collection, deeper set of information than I might normally have done just working the night shift and shelving books as they came through the slot.
Yeah.
And that was very, very helpful to me. I was extremely fortunate in being at a NASA installation when the Dialing and Information Services came to the front, for example, and being able to understand those commands at a very deep level. That afforded me a great deal of knowledge that other people might go through an entire master's degree level and never learn, because it was hands-on. I mean, I had to deliver. Harder than homework. You have to get the deliverable out, not a paper.
Right.
And so those are fortunate things. And as I moved along and expanded my network through ACES and through SLA, I met some very, very capable people who became good friends. And they included Ev Brenner from the American Petroleum Institute, Central and Abstracting and Indexing Facility. Eugene Garfield, he founded ISI. And we had grand debates about the nature of bibliographic citations and bibliometrics. I was able to get fairly early into the use of standards because it came pretty clear to me that a lot of smart people had thought about how something should be organized and how something should be put together. A woman named Jessica Milstead, who I think of as the one who put together the first edition of the Z39.19, the Controlled Vocabulary Standards. Incredibly capable woman who built a lot of thesauri, and there were some of those thesauri that were particularly useful in putting together a search for searching in the online systems. And InSpec was one that was particularly impressive to me, and the one from the InSpec thesaurus written by a woman named Jean Aitchison, and her husband Tom Aitchison became the director of InSpec, actually. And I was able to look at a lot of that kind of stuff, and I did research on my own. I was curious about the evolution of NASA Recon because I was working there, and also about Dialogue, which was an offshoot from the NASA Recon system, built by the same guy, built by Roger Summit. And so I got to know Roger Summit. I also got to know Carlos Quadra, and those people were extremely instrumental in my career and very supportive, actually, when I went out on my own. Some of them being some of them being entrepreneurs themselves. Tom Hogan, who had been at Biological Abstracts, had formed a company, actually the same year I formed mine, called Information Today, which does a lot of publishing in information, KM World, Taxonomy Bootcamp. All those things are Tom's meetings. He's also past president of ACES. He was very active in society for quite a while. So I was just very fortunate in making friends with a lot of very helpful, very interesting people that were willing to share information. There was a community of sharing that was tremendously helpful. And I met a fellow named Walt Bruning from Control Data Corporation, and he's the one that gave us the initial 2 contracts that we used to form the company. And he had a lot of faith in what we could do and what information could do and how it would be helpful to other people. So one of those databases was about alternative energy, and the other one was the government information location service. Part of the reason they gave us the alternative energy one was because at TAC, out of my department, we published a a series of bibliographies because it was nice to have somebody else do the work and bring together the research in early ANI abstracting and indexing type journals. So we had remote sensing, we had solar thermal, we had hydrogen energy, we had heat pipe energy, and wind. And those 5 publications gave us a really good grounding in not only the technology behind them, although the engineers on those knew a lot more about it than I did. I did get a good look at those items. So it was, I was just very fortunate. And of course, I'm cherry picking names out of my head because I didn't make a list of all the important people. But there were a bunch of them, and they were very helpful. And another was Dan Wild, who ran a competitive IAC to ours called NERAC, the New England Research Application Center. And he was a tough competitor, man. He was a hard guy to deal with until I quit and founded my own business. And then he became my best friend. And then 6 years later, he decided to take NERAC private, actually, as well. So we had a wonderful, wonderful time on it. There were 2 pivotal things that helped my exit from the university. One of them was that in doing that research I was talking about earlier about how NASA got its start in the information business and how Dialogue got its start. And I read a lot of papers, and I stumbled on the congressional reports. Twice a year, NASA would send a congressional report to Congress on what they were doing and all that. So I read those reports, and they were full of really interesting information, and also uncovered a lot of skullduggery in the early contracting. I was gassed. It was right there in black and white in the presentations, and I wrote a paper on it. And I submitted the paper to the second International Online Meeting in London, run by Roger Bilbo and his partner, Tom Hogan. And they accepted my paper. Well, I'm going to give a professional presentation, something other than just do a chapter, you know.
Right.
And one of the guys at NASA who'd been involved in that skullduggery had a fit. He didn't want that stuff to see the light of day. I said, it's all there in the congressional reports. They're facts. He said, you can't give the paper. I said, I'm going to give the paper. So he said, you have to write to the International Online Meeting. It was the second International Online Meeting in 1979. And 70, oh gosh, I've forgotten the date. It was the 70s, because I was still at TAC, and I left there in 78, so it must have been 77. And he said, well, you have to write and ask him to pull the paper. I said, okay, I'll write and ask him to pull the paper. And Peter White, who was the organizing conference chair, called me, international phone call to TAC. So the international calls all came in only to the accounting office. So the accountant, Deepak Dhawan's call came and said, there's a call for you from England. And so I took it in his office. And of course, everybody was so excited it was an international call. All these people congregated around me while I'm on this call. And he said, we've received a request to pull the paper. What do you want to do? And I said, I want to give the paper. He said, okay, I'll reply by C-mail. So back then you could have airmail, but it's very expensive. And we didn't have FedEx and UPS and all that stuff. Right. Par avion, we didn't have all that. So he sent a reply by C-mail, which I received 3 months later, saying it was too late to pull the paper. So I went to England and I gave the presentation. Martha Williams was way over on that side of the stage, and I was supposed to enter way over on this side of the stage at the Kensington Town Hall. And I walked across that old wooden stage to the podium, feeling really uneasy because here in the audience were all the people that were important to the information industry at that time.
And which year was this when you did the presentation?
In 77.
77, okay.
December of 77. So I gave my paper. They gave me a standing ovation. People in the audience included Roger Summit, who had been the target of the Skulduggery, Martha Williams, Ev Brenner, a lot of luminaries, Tom Aitchison, Derek, I've forgotten his name now, as well as other U.S. government people who were there. And then they took me out to dinner. Oh my gosh, I was so honored. I could barely stand it. Here I am in my late 20s with all of these people being very nice to me. And then it was shortly after that that I was able to form the company and leave. But I had by that time then established a pretty good international organization of network of friends. So can do, you got to do it. Just
no,
do
and it's amazing, I think, and the fact that you want to do a presentation and then there were hurdles on the way and trying to stop you. I think it's and how you got along that, got through that. I think people take it for granted now, but and these are all pioneering steps, right? That you did and people before you did and then people after you did. But those are important steps, and they get normalized at some point. But initially, like when you do it, it's seen as like a taboo.
Well, and I had to pay for the trip myself. And by that time we had begun, there was an active group of people who were doing online searching, and we wrote to each other a lot. And so I slept on the hotel room floor of a friend by that time, Jerry Lewis, who had who was at University of, she was in Kansas City at the medical school. I don't remember. And so people were very supportive, but it was a shoestring trip.
Right. I can imagine. And so I had a few questions from from what you said. One is during your time at NASA, I think. So what did you like there and what did you not like there?
Well, what I liked was the incredible access to information. So I told you I started on teletype, then we have that big heavy 45-pound Texas Instruments, and then I got a Texas Instruments 735 ASR, which had a built-in coupler and only weighed 17 pounds. And then I got a machine that had dual cassettes, so we'd pre-record the search, and then we'd re-record what we expected the second round of the search to be, because we were charged per connect minute. And we had to also dial from Albuquerque to Phoenix, long distance rates, because that's where the line was to the original ARPANET that connected all these things. We didn't have one in Albuquerque until much later. So right. I was able to get really fast at that, but it also meant I was the only one, I was one of the few who could do the searching. Because minutes cost a lot of money. So I loved doing that. I loved teasing it out. I had one customer who was from a government agency, and he would come in with $800 once a month, and he would ask me questions, and I was to do the search. So he'd sit at my side and he'd ask me questions. Well, he was obviously CIA, for heaven's sakes, and he wanted to know what kind of information was available open source. So my game was to try to figure out what he was really asking for when he wasn't really asking for it. And it was a fascinating kind of reference interview to do with that kind of a person. And he always went away quite disgruntled because we found a whole lot more stuff in the open literature than he thought should be there. So I love that. I love the people I worked with. I love the network. I love the information. I didn't love my boss's boss.
Okay.
He was not a good person, and he's really the reason I quit. but that's probably not a public story.
Right. And you were there for 5 years, right?
I was.
Yeah. And I think the second question I had was on Eugene Garfield. So what were your interactions with him like? What did you think of?
Well, when I first met him, I was giving a presentation. He and Sam Walpert was a guy who founded Predicast, an early business information system. I was giving a presentation at the NICE meeting, and the two of them heckled me from the back. For heaven's sakes, I'm just trying to give a presentation, and these guys are shouting, "That's bullshit," from the back of the room. And I'm going, this is not nice. So I finished my presentation and I marched up to those guys after the session was over. And I said, "What is this?" And they started laughing. "We just wanted to see what you could handle."
Wow.
That is not nice. But anyway, they both became friends, although Sam died fairly early of Alzheimer's. It was really unfortunate. But Gene became a very strong personal friend. He joined my board of directors. I stayed at his house a number of times. We'd always go out to dinner when we got the chance. And he had a number of wives, as you probably know, but Muhir, his last wife, same age as me, and we became great friends as well. So she was a secretary for 22 years before he retired. So she knew where all the bodies were. Gene was not much for small talk. He was too focused on the business and the business of the business, meaning information science, bibliometrics, history of authors and how things would have changed if the author something. So I brought him a use case. My uncle, my mom's brother, was a noted physicist named John Howard Hubble, and he had written a lot of papers, but one of the things he did early in his career was the X-ray attenuation coefficient tables at what was then the National Bureau of Standards and later became the National Institute for Standards and Technologies. Anyway, Uncle John had been cited more than 4,000 times. But his first paper, somebody else said, "John, would you mind if I was listed first on the paper?" He had no beans about that. You know, nobody to guide him and say, "Well, John, it's your work. You should be the first paper. Right. You should be the first author." So Gene and some members of his team and I thought this would be an interesting case study. So what if John had actually been the first author? He was cited more than 4,000 times on his own rights. What if he'd been the first author? And it was hundreds of thousands of paper different. It was a fascinating study. We had such a good time with it. Anyway, so Gene was a wonderful and very generous man. Generous with his time, generous with his thoughts, but he didn't suffer fools. He became very impatient with people. He also he was an entrepreneur and he eventually sold his company, but people don't realize that when you run your own company, you don't necessarily have a lot of money. But people would assume, because he was president of ISI, that he would have bundles of money, and so they would let him pick up the check at dinner. Well, actually, one of his people would pick up the check at dinner, but it always annoyed him. So if you're going out to dinner with Gene, you either fought over the check or you paid or you went Dutch, meaning that everybody paid their own freight.
Yeah.
But he considered it arrogance, so the librarians particularly, who assumed that because they sometimes searched his stuff and bought his publications, that he would buy him dinner. It was just, it used to annoy him.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, no, that is good. That was amazing. And I had a related question on standards, right? So you have worked on a number of standards. But people watching this interview may not know what standards are or why they are important. So maybe you want to give them a little bit of an overview.
Well, there are several kinds of standards, actually. There are the official standards, which come from, in the case of the United States, the American National Standards Institute, ANSI. Information and library standards come out of one of the divisions of the of ANSI. So ANSI does everything from the tread of a bolt to the size of a socket for a light bulb, to the USB ports that you use, to measuring what the wavelengths are for radio transmissions and so on. There's standards for all of those things. And the good thing about them is that means that one device can communicate with another device really easily. So creating those standards is an important activity. The challenge in it is that you don't want to do it too soon, because you disrupt innovation. But on the other hand, I don't know how many plugs you have, but there's all these different types of plugs that we all have stored away in our desks of different sizes and types. And why do there have to be so many? Why can't we just, get something that would be, whoops, I can't do this on the screen.
Yeah. Yeah, now I can see it, yeah.
And so the standardization really helps in that devices can communicate with one thing and another. In information, our need for standards is a little different in that we're dealing with textual material. And in text, it's a little more challenging to get the standards right. So we've come up with the bibliographic citation on the one hand. In the days of the early online, we just needed a few fields. We needed author, title, date of publication, a few, maybe the publisher, just a few fields, plus some information about what the subjects were about, which we variously call subjects and descriptors and keywords, and we really need a standard for that. But that was all you needed. You didn't need 650 mark fields to determine what to make a search. So as online retrieval became more active, it became clear that the classification systems from Mark that Henriette Avram did in 1964 there were too many fields, and we only needed maybe 14 or 15 of them. And so one year in the basement of OCLC, I was invited to join a group of people to come up with a meeting of the minds about this online stuff versus the traditional library stuff. And because OCLC was in Dublin, Ohio, we called it the Dublin Core. And we came up with a list of fields that would be appropriate. Stu Weibel and Eric, oh man, I can't believe I forgot. Eric, the RDF guy, came up with all together, the people in that room. It was a long folding table on folding chairs in a basement room at OCLC that came up with that original list of Dublin Core items. And it was a standard that then I worked on with a number of other really capable people. As time went on, it became clear that that was going to work pretty well, and maybe we should start exchanging. Maybe we could put a number. You have the ISSN and the ISBN and the ISAN and all these different ISANs type numbers. Maybe we could just have a number for the article, because the ISSN might have, any particular issue of a journal, you might have 6 to 30 papers in there, and they all have the same number. So that's too hard to differentiate. So came up with the idea of having a number, but in order to separate the numbers properly, we needed to have something that would maybe differentiate the number into different pieces, and came up with the DOI. And the DOI syntax is pretty straightforward in that there's a decimal point. And on one side of the decimal point, there's a 10 slash, and this, after the slash is the publisher number. And then after the dot, it's anything you want to put. That's the publisher's choice. In order to make those work, we needed to have all kinds of additional technology. And the guys that originally developed the internet came up with some of the really cool technology for that, Vint Cerf and his gang. So in order to make that work for publishers, there were a lot of people who had built a lot of very good thesauri and spent a lot of money applying those terms to the records that they took in and categorized, and they didn't want to see their business model torpedoed. So NFACE, at that time, the National Federation for Abstracting and Indexing Services, it changed its names to become more with the times, and then eventually merged with NISO to form NISO Plus just a few years ago, 4 or 5, I think. They appointed a committee, and I was part of that committee. It was led, well, it was Tim Inglesby from AIP, Michael Dennis from ChemAbs, Helen Atkins really took the helm from ISI at the time, and Christine Mater, and I think there were 6 of us. And we came up with what we called the contributed metadata set. And the reason for that was so that all the members of NFACE could still survive. Their business models wouldn't be ruined, but we'd be able to put the information together into a system that would get the DOI number, the associated bibliographic information, the metadata, and differentiate the title so that people could get their hands on it more easily. We needed to speed that because publishing was still moving more and more quickly, and lots of papers were being published and things are getting lost. So very good research being buried because nobody knew how to retrieve it. So we put that together. Helen gave the presentation at the International DOI Foundation meeting for the contributed metadata set. The rest of us sat in the audience with bated breath, hoping that they would accept it, and they did. So Norman Paskin said, yes, I think we can go ahead with that. And so then out of that, oh, that's who else was there. Very important. Ed Pence was also at that time part of Harcourt, and he was a member. He eventually became head of Crossref with the resulting organization. So standards like that were really important to forming the backbone of what we do today. Okay, so standards, if we can't talk to each other and get to know that the solid background and the exchange of information is the same. So as I said earlier, with text, it's a little more challenging, but it's still the same situation in that we are exchanging information just as though we were trying to flip on a electrical circuit. We want to know that what's coming to us, the content will be different, but the information is formatted in a way that we can share it broadly and easily.
Right. So I think it helps ensure consistency and a certain level of predictability as to what you're dealing with.
And it also includes, consistency, accuracy, all of those things are incredibly important.
Yeah, and for people who don't know, I think what you were talking about was DOI, which is Document Object Identifier, and that helps give a unique identity to every research article or publication that's put out online, and it gives a URL through which you can uniquely go to that particular paper published in any journal anywhere. Right. And now it's very commonplace to put your DOI with every research article.
Stands for Digital Object Identifier, and you
digital object identifier. Yeah,
and you can add as much what we call contributed metadata as you want to that surrounding your DOI.
The DOI, yeah. Yeah, thank you, Marjorie. And so I have another bigger question, but you can maybe talk about it briefly. So how would you describe the information science field, its history, and your own role within it? I know you talk about Jean Garfield, but maybe you can add something to this.
It's been fun. I don't know what else to say. My own role is kind of a voice behind the curtain. I do a lot of, I've built a lot of the tools and a lot of the databases that are behind the scenes in everyday use today, about more than 600 of them in over 2,000 engagements. And so it's been a fun and varied role. I love the new puzzles that are always coming forward. It's always something new, something different, some new content. The use cases vary significantly, and yet the approach to them is still worth taking. I do have some, I'm sitting this one out, waiting to see what happens with the ChatGPT. We had the SciGen activity from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, for many years. And we did write a SciGen detector, and we detected a lot of papers for a lot of publishers in their content. But now when they came out with SciGen 3 and then ChatGPT, particularly ChatGPT 3, it was very hard. I don't have the kind of money that it would take to build those training sets to detect that information. And so I'm waiting a little bit to see how it settles down, and then probably dive back in.
Yeah, I think ChatGPT has already like changing a lot of things, and we don't know how it's going to influence things like programming and front-end programming. Even people, I was talking to a cousin recently, and he said that novel writing would also probably the way gone, and we will not need people to write stories and books because ChatGPT will do it for you.
Well,
So,
we did ask ChatGPT to write some taxonomies because we make those for a living. And one of the, we asked it for 3, and it brought back 3, and 2 of them were very similar to ones that we had created that are in the open domain. And so I think there's going to be huge copyright and plagiarism.
Yes, yeah, because they're picking up a lot of things from the open domain and then putting forth them as results.
Yeah, it's going to be hard.
Even I think a lot of artists are also concerned because their artworks are being used to generate the artworks that some of the artificial intelligence-based artwork is being done.
I think it'll be interesting. There's some massive stuff coming forward. And people don't understand artificial intelligence in general anyway. So, I mean, they think of HAL, the computer in 2001 Space Odyssey, but really we've all been using a tremendous amount of AI every day in automation of all kinds of things. So.
Yeah. So you talked about the people who have influenced your work, and you mentioned a number of them. So any other maybe books that have influenced you, or any incidents that really shaped you?
So in terms of books, I tend to like to read a lot of history. Yeah. It's orthogonal to what I do. I would say that the Casati report was a pivotal piece of information for me. I also read a lot of Thesauri. They're outlines of knowledge. And I love looking at those. You know, you get a very superficial, I admit, view of an industry if you build a taxonomy for it, because you need to understand how their nomenclature goes together. And if you can figure out the nomenclature, you can sound amazingly smart about things you really know nothing about. It's astounding. I've been to annual meetings of several learned societies where I built the thesaurus, and I needed to see the community in action to understand how they, in what sequence do they use those words that they use so frequently. Because without that context and that culture, you don't really have a very good handle on how well those things work. I liked reading Business at the Speed of Thought by Bill Gates. I guess I read a lot of technical reports, which are not too gripping, which is probably why I read novels. And I just finished reading The Scandinavian Kings of England and The Dark Queens and several other things of that ilk, because you need a little variety in life.
Right. And one thing is fascinating for me as you talk about thesaurus, because I had interviewed Brenda Derwin, and her work was more about how people impose all these terms and abbreviations wherever you go to make them sound important, and those terms are thrown at you all the time, right? Whether you go to a computer store or you go anywhere. And even when you go to a library, like terms like catalog and reference and all might be terms which a layperson may not be familiar with. So what you're talking about, like reading thesaurus, I think it's I never thought about that, and that's very important, because I think that can really it can make it, as you said, right? It can make you sound a lot more knowledgeable than most people think of, because those terms are there anywhere in any field.
Well, a lot of the early philosophers did outlines of knowledge. John Locke did one, and Thomas Aquinas did one, and Descartes did one, and Lenin did one. Marx did one. All these guys, Mao, Tseng, all of them outlined the world from their point of view, and a thesaurus does the same thing. It outlines a specific field of knowledge, whether it's chemistry or physics or optics or psychology or civil engineering or cancer, all different points of view. We have two clients. One is, well, we have more than two, but the American Society for Clinical Oncology and the American Society for Cancer Research might sound like they cover the same kind of topical areas, but they don't. One of them covers cancer from a research point of view, and the other covers it from a clinical point of view, and those approaches are very different. But the interesting thing is that AACR calls them neoplasms, and the clinical guys, ASCO people, call them cancers. So right at the get-go, the culture is radically different, and it's hard for people from one of those spheres to talk to the other, because they think orthogonally. They're just not thinking the same direction at all.
Right. And any other incidents that shaped you? You spoke about a number of things through your childhood, but anything else that you might have missed? You think that any incidents?
Well, I don't think I covered anything about Access Russia. So we've had two international companies. One was in Mexico. The Access de Mexico, it was a keyboarding operation in Mexico that we had for. And then I got involved through the Maxwell Macmillan Corporation through a guy named Ron Dunn, in trying to figure out why the Maxwell arrangement with the All-Union, the Soviet Institute for Scientific and Technical Information, was not going very well. So Robert Maxwell is a fairly infamous person in the information business. There's a book called Maxwell, which is fascinating. Right. The VNITI, the All-Union Institute for Scientific and Technical Information, had agreed to give all its information to Maxwell Macmillan Publishing so that they could bring all that Russian information and get it published in the West, which was of high interest, because what goes on behind the scenes in Russia, we don't really understand that country very well. We still don't. I have lots of opinions about why that is. Stemming from that outline of knowledge, their outline of knowledge is not John Locke, sorry, it's Marx. And he thinks of things in a different order. The educational system thinks of things in a different order. So we hear about things one way and we interpret it according to our own preset outline, and their outline's different. Sorry, they don't think about it that way. They don't classify it there. And so you aren't going to get the same answers. I think that's a really deep problem with our intelligence, is that they are thinking, they are assessing the information in terms of what they think instead of the outline of knowledge that the Russians use. Anyway, that's an aside.
Yeah.
So I went over there. I went for 10 days. A guy named Michael Dixon went with me. He was supposed to be kind of making sure I got to see all the right people and learned what was going on. And the state of their technology was horrible. But Maxwell had promised them photocopy machines and microfilming machines. And they were very much looking forward to them. And the machines had been shipped. And so Veneti started delivering 9-track tapes of their data. And then it was fairly quickly discovered that neither side trusted the other particularly. So the Russians had shipped the 9-track tapes of the articles without the metadata. No author, no title, no any of that kind of stuff. And in return, Maxwell had shipped the microfilming machines without cameras and the photocopy machines without batteries.
Yeah.
So it was worthless.
Yeah.
So once I was able to determine that, the deal fell apart. But I was fascinated by the information. And so we founded a company with some of the people that I met there, which we called Access Russia. And we ran that company from 1988 to 1999 when I sold it to some Russian fellows who carried it on. So those were fascinating years. We had to take the payroll in cash, and send people over with $10,000 a month, just under the allowable amount of money that you could bring in. And yes, those were fascinating years.
So, and you talked about the can-do attitude that you imbibed from early on. So apart from that, I think, what are some of the key skills that you have developed that have helped you over the years?
Curiosity is certainly one of them. Willingness to embrace new technologies and new ideas. Sometimes I embrace them a little too early. So you want to be in the cutting edge, but not necessarily the bleeding edge of a new technology. That's a huge difference, and a mistake I've made more than once, actually. Getting involved in something too early. For me, Roger Bilbo once told me that ideas are cheap, implementation is expensive, and he's right. So you can have a ton of great ideas. Most entrepreneurs like myself are idea generators. We're always coming up with, oh, we could do this, we could do that, we could do this. But you have to moderate that with what you can actually accomplish. So your long run plan can be incredibly optimistic, but the short run tactical plan needs to be a little different. People talk about their business plans and their strategic plans. What you need is a tactical plan. How are you going to get from A to B in a fairly short order? And that is something that my business partner, Jay Van Nieman, has been very, very helpful. Been in business 45 years. It's a long time for any company. And it's that moderation. So I might be the flywheel, but he's the axle around which we turn.
No, I think that's kind of like me as well. Like a lot of times I get like a lot of new ideas, and I've also learned, as you mentioned, to temper a lot of them down. And you'll see that some of those ideas were early on, but over the years, like you have the idea and you know that it's going to succeed, but you don't have the time or the energy to work on that because of the 10 of the different things that you're working on.
Or the money.
Or the money, yeah. So I think, and another thing which I think it was Sandra Erdelis who once told me that there's nothing called a low-hanging fruit. So no matter what idea you take on, even if you think it's very easy, it takes a lot. It takes much more than what you think it would take. So typically now what I think is that if something's going to take a year, I do it into 3. So at least 3 years, like, because it takes much more, a lot of things come into it once you start working on it. So yeah, thank you for that. And what do you think have been your biggest successes?
Well, I think my people. I have a wonderful team of people, and some of them have moved on to new positions over the years, but many of them are still with us, and tremendously competent, capable folks. Beyond that, there's some projects that I'm particularly proud of. We did the AOL search early on, and that launched to significant fanfare. We also did a bunch of other databases, and it's been very rewarding for people to be able to search through and get their information fairly actively and rapidly, accurately. I'm not too big on relevance. I think I talked to you once about that. I'm big on precision and recall. I like accurate, consistent information, and the better we can organize it and code it, and the more we can do it programmatically. So my focus has always been on automating what we can, the clerical aspects of things, so that we can have people's brains continue to rush ahead.
Right. And what phases of your life have made you resilient? Like, what are the hardest and challenging times that required you to be your strongest and not break down under pressure?
Well, there are 2 kinds of those. One is a small business lives on cash flow. So when cash flow is bad, you're tightening the belts and you're figuring out what you can do and what you can't do with cash available, and still needing to move forward. Those times are always challenging, and those are just regular cycles in the business life. But they do sometimes get your attention and make you ever more creative. The others have to do with people and health. So when people are not well, to me, people come first. And so helping shore them up, whether it's a parent or a child or a spouse, that has to come first in my book. And some of those times have been particularly challenging.
Right.
Still,
yeah.
I'm still dealing with my parents' estate, for example, and it's been 6 years. And I've done others. I did my fraternal grandmothers. I did my dad's. Now I'm doing my mom's. I did my mother-in-law's. So it's not that I'm unfamiliar with them, but bringing along all the other people. I am not the only hard-charging person in a family of 4 kids.
Right.
So making sure that we all remain good friends at the end of this process is a very high goal of mine, and that's been challenging.
Yes. Yeah. And how do you think these tough phases affect your life purpose in some way, being the resilience part of it?
Well, when you come out fine the other end, you've got a bunch of additional techniques and methodologies to deal with what you're dealing with. And you're also able to look up and find new horizons. But I think probably I'm an eternal optimist. So I'm always thinking that things are going to turn out fine in the end.
Right.
And so far they have.
Yeah. And what is something you wish you knew earlier in your life?
Well, I wish I'd understood how expensive marketing is. Marketing and sales and communications. Any entrepreneur is the main salesperson for their company. And so fortunately, there's 2 of us, plus my daughter is part of the company too. So the 3 of us form the sales team now. We have tried many times to hire a good salesperson and failed. So not doing that anymore. And I wish I'd realized that much earlier, because instead of turning things over to yet another new recruit, I would have just charged ahead and made the sales myself. I should have bulked up other administrative areas more and not gone with the sales.
And what are your life principles or values that you follow? Like, what are your life lessons?
Well, I think I've alluded to many of them. It's people first.
Yeah.
People are the important thing. Whether they're friends, relatives, whatever, there's no sense getting yourself in a position where there's grudges held and people are angry and annoyed and burning bridges and that kind of thing. It just doesn't do you any good. Doesn't do anybody any good. And the next you meet might be the perfect one. My mother used to play solitaire, and I'd look at it and say, I think you lost that one, Mom. And she'd say, nope, there's another card I can turn over, and it just takes one card
To turn everything over. Yeah.
And she was right. I mean, it does. And it just takes one person, one contact. So you just can't be arrogant about well, I'm Mr. Very Important, and therefore go away, you're bothering me, kind of thing. What you need to do is keep an open mind and realize that young person that you meet on the street, that guy in the little hut with his shaggy haired friend, might be, and indeed they were, the next Microsoft. So they got their start in Albuquerque. Actually, I think that's a little known fact, but they're they might be building the next best thing and might be the next whiz kid, and so there's no sense burning any of those bridges. So I think taking people as they are, as they come, and not burning any bridges is incredibly important. It's also important to keep track of cash. Cash flow, as I said, is the lifeblood of a company. You have to keep track of it.
So I'm glad you talked about people, but there's one thing I've been struggling with lately, and maybe you can help me here, is that, and I wrote this in my notes on my phone recently, is that when you hate haters, then you become a hater too. Right? So, and in the sense that because we have so many people now who are exhibiting being exclusivist and not being inclusive, or being racist, or hating and all that, or othering other people.
Yeah.
And when I look at them, like I try to deal with them with compassion and love, but at the same time, it's exhausting sometimes. And so how do you? So how do you deal with people who deal with people badly, like who treat other people badly?
Well, I think in our current political situation, for example, the press is just like fanning the fires. You know, we have a hot wind blowing on a grass fire. You can't do anything. You just got to get out of the way, or build a fire break. And we don't have any fire breaks in this current nastiness that kees going around. I mean, they covered the coronation, for example. Well, the coronation was a huge, intricate, centuries old, elaborate pomp and circumstance ceremony with tremendous amounts of meanings. So what they do, they talk about Meghan Markle.
Yeah.
She's nothing to do with it. Come on. But the reason they're doing that is because people are reading it. I mean, it's selling the papers. It's like the Spanish-American War was started by Hearst Enterprises to sell more papers. And once people finally realized it, they stopped it. But it took a while to figure that out, and shots were fired. But I don't own a television, and I don't watch the news. I read the news. That way I read it fast. I read much, much faster than I speak. And so I'm able to absorb a great deal. I read about 6 newspapers every morning, because I want to get a good feel for the diversity of the news. If you only read the New York Times, then you think like the New York Times. And if you read the Washington Post, you think like that. But if you read the New York Post, you get a completely different view. If you read The Economist, it's not the same as the Wall Street.
Right.
And so on. So I think people need to read from different sources. I also read the Sydney Times because it's a new kind of point of view for me. But when people hate, they hate from my point of view, a different number of reasons. They hate out of ignorance because they're afraid. They hate because somebody told them to hate. And then optimistically, there's some education to be done. And some people hate because they think it makes them important. Yeah. They feel like they, if they're having a tizzy fit about this or that or the other thing, it makes them feel so much important. Oh my God, he just blah, 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 blah. I find that totally harebrained and unnecessary to listen to, but it does make them feel important. So it's a matter of importance, fear, or ignorance.
Yeah, and I'm not sure ignorance, because sometimes I feel it's feigned ignorance, in the sense that some of them I've seen, they know exactly what they're doing. But so it's power and fear. I think the two things that you talk about, making them feel important and being and they're afraid of something. They're afraid of being inclusive, so that like more people will come steal your jobs or something like that, steal what rights you have or what privileges you have.
And they might be afraid of losing power.
Losing power too, or sharing power even.
True. Yeah, but I hope we can soon figure out that fire break to stop this divisiveness. And I was just in South Texas. I was bird watching. That's how come I got in so late last night. And the rainbow of people down there is just delightful. And completely interacting, ignoring all the other quotas and so on that we have to come up with to please all the people in power. They just interact and they just like each other and they find things good in each other. That's fun.
Oh, that's good. So yeah, I hope we do find a solution to it, or a fire break, as you say. But at the same time, I do know that this is going to continue forever, at least to whatever degree. So I think we have to, I just hope that we have more people who are trying to be more inclusive and liking people and treating people as people.
Well, treating people as people means that you can't boil them down to statistics.
Yeah.
So if you say, well, I have this many of that color and this many of that persuasion, to meet your statistical goals, you're dividing them. And when you divide people, that's divisive. So we need to stop dividing people. We need to just let people be people.
Yeah. Thank you, Marjorie. And what does happiness mean to you?
Well, I am fortunate to be surrounded by a very large, warm, and loving family. And that means a lot to me. I'm also fortunate in being able to work with very interesting things. I'm not bored. And that was another thing that I learned early on from my mom is if you were to say, I'm bored, she'd say, well, if you're bored, I got something you can do. And she would give us something that was maybe not something we wanted to do, like weed the garden or snip some beans or go water this or clean that. So you either found things to keep yourself interested, or she would give you something to do, which might not be nearly as interesting as you would have liked. So if people are bored, it's their own fault.
Yeah,
and I'm bored, and therefore I'm happy.
Oh, that's wonderful. I just finished teaching a course called Happiness and Leadership to undergraduates. So that was the first time I taught that. So that was a lot of fun.
That's interesting.
Yeah, for 14 weeks.
Wow.
And yeah, so I think it was a lot of, so like the kind of conversations I had with you today, I think would have been really helpful to them. it's a lot of those lessons. I think then those are very young kids, like they're all, I think, about 20 years, in 20 or nearing, I think 18 to 20, it's first year undergraduates.
You know, when we were that age, we didn't think we were young.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I remember thinking of myself as grown up when I was 10. So I get that. Yeah. So what are your goals now?
Well, I'm going to work until I don't like what I'm doing. And so far I like it. So I guess I'll keep working. I have grandkids to spend some time with. I want to spend more time, always more time with them. They grow so quickly. Yeah. And with the rest of my family, my husband, my partner, my kids, my grandkids, my siblings, we're all very close. And that's a really wonderful thing for me.
Okay. So that's wonderful. Thank you, Marjorie. And what mentoring advice would you have for people who might follow in your footsteps?
Well, I would say you ought to be interested in the people around you. And yeah, be interested, be aware, be curious, and find something that you love to do. And when you've found a passion, follow it.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think that was from my side. Do you have anything else that you'd want to add that you thought you missed?
No, I'll probably think of a dozen things after we hang up.
Okay. Thank you so much, Marjorie. This is wonderful. And I know that you were tired this morning, but thank you for making the time.
You bet.
And this has really been wonderful. I'm sure it'll be very helpful to a lot of people.
Okay. I'll see you in London.
Yes. See you in London, Marjorie.